How does Knuckles keep the Chaos Emeralds clean? By using knuckle dusters. Hey everyone, Johnny Vector here, Fleetway enthusiast. I've talked before about how much I like Fleetway's version of Amy Rose, but another standout Fleetway character, in my opinion, is Knuckles. Knuckles the Echidna had a string of solo stories in the Fleetway Sonic the Comic series in the 1990s that have remained huge favourites among Sonic the Comic fans for good reason, because they boast wonderful artwork and also paint a very interesting picture of Knuckles' character, which is actually somewhat unlike his characterization in other media. If you're not a huge fan of Knuckles being depicted as a bit naive, a bit too stoic, or a bit of a bonehead, then Fleetway Knuckles may be for you. Before I begin, please do let me know your thoughts in the comments below about whether you feel Fleetway got Knuckles right or whether they got him wrong. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Oh, and spin dash that subscribe button as well. The channel is nearly at 60,000 subscribers, which is amazing. Thank you so much for the support. Now, there was a string of stories written by Sonic the Comic veteran Nigel Dobbyn and illustrated by Nigel Dobbyn. In this little video, I want to run through these stories, share them with you, and use them to illustrate why Fleetway Knuckles' characterization is spot on. The stories encompass what's become known as the Knuckles World Tour of Mobius story arc. Let me catch you up on Fleetway Knuckles before we dive into the stories. Knuckles debuted in the Sonic 3 and Knuckles adaptation, which followed the game's story closely. He was duped by Robotnik, teamed up with Sonic, and remained on the floating island as its protector at the story's end. Significantly, Dr. Zachary later appeared on the floating island, the only other known living echidna, who turned out to be a villain who shattered the Master Emerald before falling off the floating island. More on him in my Dr. Zachary video. What's important to note is that the energy contained within the Master Emerald had transferred into the head of an ancient echidna robot, which kept the island afloat. It was a temporary solution, and that leads us nicely to the first part of Knuckles' long journey outside of his usual territory as he engages on a quest for a new Master Emerald. With all that said, let me introduce you to the first story in this arc, the Graveyard. With that short summary over, we pick up with Knuckles on a journey for a replacement Master Emerald. This quest takes him to a part of the floating island that he's never visited before, the isolated Kohenyu Graveyard, which surrounds the Emerald Mine. While navigating the rough terrain, Knuckles accidentally falls down a large ravine and is knocked out by some poisonous fauna on the way down. He wakes up imprisoned and meets the Spirit of the Herd, a ghostly image of a Stegosaurus who has an intense dislike of echidnas. The Spirit of the Herd seems to reanimate the bones of his Stegosaurus brethren who threaten Knuckles, and Knuckles wonders whether the effects of the poison are causing him to hallucinate all of this, or whether he really is fighting the reincarnated skeletons of long deceased dinosaurs. Whatever the case, the poison causes him to pass out a second time, and when he wakes, he's trapped inside a giant skeletal ribcage in the Emerald Mine. The Spirit of the Herd tells Knuckles his rather tragic story. Long before the arrival of the echidnas, the dinosaurs lived peacefully on the floating island, but they were hunted to the point of extinction by the echidnas. This is framed by Knuckles as an unfortunate accident, as the echidnas didn't realise the scarcity of males among the dinosaur pod and killed the few males among them while hunting. But the Spirit of the Herd doesn't quite see it this way. Knuckles undoubtedly feels bad about the fate of the dinosaurs, but he's still a bit of a hothead deep down, and when threatened with extinction by the Spirit of the Herd, he uses his digging abilities to escape from his cage, but he's pursued by skeletal dinosaurs while he tries to extract a new emerald from the mine. He finds an especially large one, the so-called Soul Crystal, but is warned off it by the Spirit, revealing that the powerful stone is the Force reanimating the Herd. Knuckles threatens to smash it and break the Spirit's power, but doing so would erase the last traces of the Herd forever. After smashing down the ever-reanimating skeletons, Knuckles resolves to destroy the Soul Crystal, but he just can't do it. Instead, he and the Spirit bond over the loss of their respective peoples. And Knuckles shares with the Spirit his tragic fate as the last of the Echidnas. The Spirit allows Knuckles to leave with a replacement Master Emerald, and Knuckles leaves feeling optimistic about the future of the floating island. The Graveyard story kind of concludes with a mini one-off story called The New Master Emerald. Knuckles brings the new Master Emerald to the Emerald Chamber, but the robot head that's still harnessing the old Emerald's energy goes a little berserk during the Emerald transfer process. It's eventually tamed by Knuckles, who drains most of its power and hopes that he can use the robot to find out more about his people. I'll get this out of the way now and say that this has remained perhaps my favourite story in Sonic the Comic history. You'll hear me say this a lot, but the art is absolutely phenomenal by Dobbyn here. The evocative use of colour is just so beautiful. And even though the landscape is barren, every panel feels visually arresting. When you see Dobbyn's art digitally coloured, it's not nearly as impressive. His hand-painted colouring is really what makes his artwork so rich and full. The last panel in particular is a mini masterpiece. It'd make for a great print to hang on the office wall. Note that Dobbyn had a tendency to draw Knuckles with a bit of an elongated head, but weirdly I kind of like it because it forms a real contrast to Sonic's slicker design. The writing of this particular strip is also top-notch. Having the Master Emerald itself be replaceable is an interesting concept. Does it cheapen the importance of the Master Emerald? Not in my opinion. I think the idea of echidnas mining emeralds to store chaos energy inside makes for a fascinating backstory and poses some serious questions, which the comic does answer later on. More so than the lore implications of the story, it's the emotional maturity of Knuckles that makes this strip a memorable one. Keep in mind that Knuckles has only met a handful of people in his lifetime, most of whom have tried to take advantage of him. Rather than being painted as a stereotypically naive doofus, Knuckles has a justifiably short fuse and can lash out, but he's ultimately a tragic figure who grapples with a lot of inner turmoil due to being the last of the Echidnas. In this story, when Knuckles' anger subsides and he shows empathy towards the Spirit, it makes for a touching conclusion. You'll actually notice a pattern that Knuckles' stories often end with Knuckles getting out of sticky situations using his words and emotional intelligence rather than his fists. It contrasts with the more action-packed way that Fleetway Sonic strips tend to end. Knuckles is wonderfully deep and wise in Sonic the Comic, and it's a portrayal that's easy to love. Next up, we have a story arc that sees Knuckles team up with notorious sky pirate Captain Plunder and his crew of vagabonds in The Ghost Ship. You can hear more about Plunder in my Sonic the Comic massive retrospective video. For now though, all you need to know is that he's a semi-comical figure who has clashed with Sonic and Knuckles in the past, and has raided the floating island before, stealing some treasures from Sandopolis Zone. The pirates are up to miscellaneous hijinks near the floating island, when the sight of something in the sky that looks like a flying ghost ship throws them off course, and they descend to the floating island. The island, by the way, is currently the home of a large community of Emerald Hill folk who are taking refuge from Dr. Robotnik, and also Porker Lewis, a former member of Sonic's Freedom Fighters who has taken up permanent residence on the island to help Knuckles try to make sense of the recently discovered Echidna technology. Knuckles is warned by some of the Emerald Hill folk of the arrival of the pirates, but he actually helps Captain Plunder to get a second glimpse of the ghost ship by piloting the floating island upwards. Plunder reveals that he has a treasure trove full of schematics and diagrams pertaining to the floating island, and he agrees to share them with Knuckles. But there's only one problem: they're a long way away at his pirate hideout. More immediately, Plunder really wants to get on the ghost ship, so he ziplines over from the floating island. He boards the ghost ship to Plunder, an ancient idol, thinking the ship deserted. However, his underlings are captured by the ghost ship's crew, the Tantaragors, a race of extremely powerful, godlike beings. The trio are evidently based on deities from Egyptian mythology. Now, I do apologise, but some of the scans for this story arc in particular are very low quality online, but you'll have to bear with me. In issue 76, Knuckles and Captain Plunder realise that the ship they're on is full of slaves. Before they can do anything to help them, Captain Plunder manages to activate the Tantaragor idol, which is actually a transportation device, transporting him, his crew, and Knuckles to Scourge Bay, a remote pirate hideout. Knuckles and Captain Plunder's work is seemingly done. Plunder has the idol that he was after, and it's also in Scourge Bay, where Plunder has his treasure chest full of useful info about the floating island that he mentioned earlier. He offers to transport Knuckles back to the floating island, but Noble Knuckles wants to reboard the Tantaragor ship and save the Mobian slaves. The two squabble about what to do and erupt into a big brawl, but then a huge Tantaragor shows up, this time a figure based on Hinduism, visually inspired by Ganesh and Shiva. This monstrous being, Aklitos, transports the whole cove to the spiritual plane of the Tantaragors. Aklitos, who is the spiritual leader of the Tantaragors, tells Knuckles that not all Tantaragors are evil. In fact, the ones operating the ship are worshippers of an old, deceased heretical priest and want to enslave a workforce to build a monumental pyramid in his honor. Aklitos grants Knuckles his wish of being transported back to the slave ship to try and free the Mobian slaves. Knuckles doesn't stand much of a chance against the ghostly Tantaragor heretics. There's a really cool mini scene where a Tantaragor reaches through Knuckles, which is quite chilling, but Aklitos interferes again, bringing proceedings to a close. He warns the heretics that they will be punished, and returns Knuckles and co. to Mobius. After having a squabble with Knuckles earlier, Plunder doesn't really want to give up his treasure chest of floating island secrets anymore, but he's compelled to by the queen of the pirates, Zorobel. Knuckles has freed the slaves and he's got a wealth of information about the floating island, but there's only one issue. He's now a long way away from home, he has a huge chest to carry, and there's no offer of a lift back from Captain Plunder. Analysing this strip, once again, I've got to glaze Dobbyn. The use of colour in Ghost Ship is just so lush. The gentle sky blue of the Tantaragor Ghost Ship and realm contrasts wonderfully with the bright orange glow of the ghostly heretics and the bold red of Aklitos. It's colour theory 101, right? But it just looks so clean. It's minimalistic in the right sort of way. Writing wise, I happen to enjoy this story because I love how bonkers Fleetway could be. Sky pirates in Sonic's world doesn't make a lot of sense on paper, but it somehow works and makes the world a little bit richer. Plunder is sometimes an ally and sometimes an antagonist, and in a world where Robotnik is pure evil and the goodies are so righteous, having a morally grey character adds some much needed depth. Writer Nigel Kitching has admitted that he'd often start stories without a definitive ending, and this story is cited as an example. You can kind of tell, because the Tantaragors never appear or are referenced again. Doesn't make a whole lot of sense, but that happens sometimes when you're trying to create a villain of the week, I guess. Kitching's writing and Dobbyn's art do complement each other well in the smaller moments of this story, like when Knuckles is reached through by a ghostly arm. It's a tiny moment, but goes a long way in highlighting how intimidating the Tantaragors are. Overall, a decent strip, and again, it's Knuckles' moral character which ultimately saves the day. Thus begins essentially the third part of our Knuckles trilogy. He's got a new Master Emerald, he's survived a run-in with ghosts, and now he needs to get back home. Tired old Knuckles is rowing his way across the Mobian Channel when he's attacked by a mechanical octopus. Knuckles is knocked out of his ship and into the water and tries his best to grapple with the metallic tentacles. At the end of the first part of the story, the perpetrator, Captain Claw, reveals himself. He's something of a bandit patrolling the area and ready to cash in on the high bounty on Knuckles' head. Captain Claw is a cool villain. He looks very crab-like, as in very realistic, unlike the cartoony animals that make up the rest of the Sonic cast. Anyway, in the next issue, Knuckles and Claw brawl a little bit, and in the ensuing chaos, many of the surrounding rock formations begin to collapse. One of them falls right onto Captain Claw's Octonaut device, destroying it completely, and leaving Claw at the mercy of Knuckles. The story ends with Knuckles forcing Claw to row them to shore using his wrecked Octonaut as a float. It's a short but pretty fun start to Knuckles' great adventure through Mobius. Troubled Waters is super short and fairly standard villain of the week stuff, so not a huge amount here to analyse. There's not much going on visually, but the rocks look vaguely skull-like, which is a brilliant subtle touch that I never noticed when I first read this one. What really stands out in this strip is how alienating Sonic the Comic's dialogue can be, sometimes. Sonic the Comic strips are often laden with British slang, and it becomes really evident that even Knuckles has a classic British accent here. It does sometimes border on feeling jarring, seeing stoic Knuckles shouting "Wahey" as he dodges an attack. But you gotta keep in mind, the comic was originally aimed at kids and mirrors other British comics style. Claw, for example, is written with an accent that borders on being a bit posh, while Knuckles is rougher around the edges. It's that classic British comics trope of the toff getting his comeuppance by the regular Joe. Decent strip overall, if somewhat disposable, and it really highlights that the absolute strength of Sonic the Comic was always the artwork over the writing. Now the next story arc is another personal favourite of mine, the Village of the Damned. We pick up with Knuckles back on land and dragging his chest through a dark forest in the middle of the night. He stumbles across a village and enters into the lively tavern. Knuckles gets an ominously frosty welcome from the tavern's patrons. The tavern's friendly owner, a rooster, takes Knuckles up to his room, while the rest of the sinister onlookers declare Knuckles to be the one. There's something weird going on here for sure. Knuckles is woken from his slumber by the screams of a young lady being paraded through the streets tied to a huge rock. Knuckles frees this young lady, who's described by the mob as a sacrifice. They run to safety, and she explains that the village have all joined a cult dedicated to a moon goddess who demands sacrifice in exchange for a plentiful harvest. Knuckles offers to protect the lady overnight, but noticing that he's tired, she offers to look out for an hour or so while Knuckles has a catnap. He nods off and...
oh no!
The young lady has betrayed him, leading the mob right to him while he sleeps. Knuckles is the true sacrifice, and he's caged in a wicker egg. The villagers brag that under Robotnik's rule, they can easily get away with murder with no consequences. So Knuckles looks like he might be toast. Knuckles starts the final issue in his wicker egg, which is threatening to burst into flames. Knuckles manages to roll the egg-shaped cage down a hill and break free after smashing into some rocks. He clocks on that the main villager, Mr. Mesmer, seems to be able to control the rest with his staff. So Knuckles seizes it and brings the villagers back to their senses. Then we get the big reveal. That Foghorn Leghorn guy, that was Robotnik in an intricate disguise. He explains that he's used this village as a little test to see if he's able to control the minds of regular Mobians. Knuckles threatens to give Robotnik a beating, but as the planet's absolute ruler, Robotnik knows he's untouchable, and Knuckles can do nothing but wander off and hope that Robotnik gets his comeuppance at a later date. Okay, there's quite a bit to talk about when it comes to the Village of the Damned. Any horror aficionados might have clocked on that the story shares more than a few similarities with classic British folk horror movie The Wicker Man. No, not the Nicolas Cage one, the original. Apparently, Dobbyn pitched the idea to Kitching of doing a couple of genre movie inspired strips, and this was their effort at putting out a horror movie inspired story. It's kind of crazy because when I read this as a kid, I obviously had no idea about the inspiration, but the story is a PG retelling of the movie, and even the name of the pub is the same. Of course, the Wicker Man is significantly more grisly, but there is the implication here that the villagers intended to burn Knuckles alive in a wicker egg, which is a fairly sinister plotline for a Sonic comic. The end of the comic is a little bizarre the more you think about it. Robotnik being revealed to be wearing a big rooster outfit, does undercut the spooky atmosphere a tiny bit. Still, Robotnik mocking Knuckles at the end is quite pertinent. Knuckles has the same dilemma that Batman always grapples with. Does he kill Robotnik and betray his own moral code, or let him go and potentially cause more damage? As a fairly morally incorruptible figure, he chooses the latter, but it makes me wonder whether Sonic would have showed Robotnik as much mercy. Anyway, writing aside, the story is dripping with visual details and makes for a great feast for the eyes, particularly if you're an eagle-eyed horror fan looking for Wicker Man references. So next, Knuckles exits the horror genre and enters the western, continuing on his journey through the Mobian Prairie next. He immediately gets caught up in a stampede of Apteryx, which are giant birds. The herd of Apteryx belong to a trio of ranchers dressed in typical western garb, including Cheeto, who is written as a stereotype of a Mexican from a spaghetti western movie. These three ranchers blame the stampede on Knuckles, accusing him of sabotaging their Apteryx ranching operation. They tie him up and head off to Backwater City. In Backwater City, Knuckles is locked up by the deputy sheriff, who awaits the return of the sheriff proper. The deputy happens to be the son of the city's mayor, Boss Crouch, who owns the largest Apteryx ranch in the area. We learn that Cheeto is actually in cahoots with Boss Crouch and started the stampede in an attempt to kill Rooster, the owner of the competing Apteryx ranch. Having Knuckles involved in this mess offers Crouch an opportunity to engage in some corruption and pin the murder attempt on Knuckles. Crouch has evidently sowed the seeds of discontent because Knuckles is strung up on a tree by an angry mob intent on, I guess, hanging him, but he's saved at the last minute by the sheriff. The sheriff makes Knuckles his new deputy. Knuckles is evidently smarter than he looks, because he's already clocked on to the suspicious behaviour of Boss Crouch and of Cheeto. He boldly storms into a busy saloon and outright calls out Cheeto as the man who tried to kill Rooster. An all-out brawl ensues with guns and alcohol flying everywhere. Cheeto catches a beating from Knuckles and admits that Boss Crouch is now out to kill Rooster himself. Knuckles, who assumes the disguise of Cheeto, manages to extract a confession from Crouch, which I guess means that Knuckles was feigning a stereotypical Mexican accent. Crouch tries to make a run for it, and when he's cornered, he threatens Knuckles with a vial of potent liquid that he says will cause the Apteryx to fly into a stampeding rage. Unfortunately for Crouch, he falls and smashes the vial all over himself, causing the Apteryx to mow him down as a disturbed Knuckles looks on. For his efforts in bringing down Crouch, Knuckles is gifted a pterodactyl from the sheriff so that he can finally make his way home. No prizes go to anyone who identified The Good, the Bad and the Echidna as deeply inspired by Western movies. This is the second part of Dobbyn and Kitchen's little experiment turning genre movies into Sonic the Comic strips. I'm not a Western fan at all, but the name is obviously inspired by The Good, the Bad and the Ugly, and apparently Rooster the Rancher is named after Rooster Cogburn from John Wayne flick True Grit. Whether the story itself is a play on any Western movie, I'm not entirely sure. What I do know is that this is another good story that highlights Knuckles' excellent Fleetway characterization. He's not a dolt, which is an issue that I have with Knuckles' portrayal in some other forms of media. In fact, he's intuitively smart. The fact that Robotnik tricked him doesn't really hang over Knuckles' head at all. In this story, he puts two and two together expertly and outsmarts the bad guys quite easily. Knuckles isn't a technological genius or whatever, but he has street smarts, and I really like that. As I mentioned earlier, one of the main antagonists, Cheeto, speaks with a stereotypical Mexican accent. It's a little bit on the nose, and another example of how unsubtle Sonic the Comic could be in the dialogue department, which is often its weakest attribute by far. Cheeto isn't the only controversial thing about this strip. What about the hanging scene? Kitching and Dobbyn originally planned to show Knuckles with a noose around his neck. The scene didn't receive any blowback from Sega, apparently, but the comic's editor demanded some changes be made. Interestingly, according to Kitching, Sega did want any alcohol removed from the bar scenes in the story. Now, alcohol isn't explicitly mentioned, but it's kind of obvious that there's alcohol everywhere anyway. I tend to prefer Village of the Damned over this strip as someone with little interest in westerns, but I like the slightly slower pace of the story, which gives the unique setting some space to breathe. Of course, I like the wonderful Dobbyn artwork as always, and I adore the way that Knuckles is characterized here, so it's a great strip that won me over. The final story to discuss for today is Roots. We pick up with Knuckles very nearly home now. He flies over Metropolis Zone and sees a protest taking place in a park. The protesters are protecting the park, one of the last green spaces in Metropolis Zone, from Robotnik, who wants to tear it down, and are nearly met with some police brutality. Knuckles decides to offer a helping hand to the protesters, among whom is Ebony the Cat, Fleetway's resident Doctor Strange. Interestingly, this place isn't just any old park, but it's home to a race of ancient talking trees. The Elder Tree, the leader of the trees, is the oldest living creature on planet Mobius. He bravely asks the protesters to leave, perhaps accepting his fate and not wanting anyone to get hurt. Knuckles and Ebony, though, are here to stay. When some of Robotnik's heavier Goonies arrive, they grapple with the heroes, and in the scrap, the Elder Scree is obliterated by one of the Heavy's weapons, causing the rest of the trees to suddenly turn quite sinister and engulf the park in deep, dark forest. The trees threaten to destroy all life on Mobius as an act of vengeance for the felling of the Elder Tree. Robotnik's Goonies aren't impressed, but Knuckles is. He empathizes with the plight of the trees and issues an apology for the way that Mobians have abused the environment, reminding the trees that some, like the protesters, have changed their ways and want to live in harmony with nature. The noble speech by Knuckles calms the trees down. They apprehend Robotnik's goons, and the park is saved. We learn that the entire area is later fenced off by Robotnik and becomes a haven of natural life. And at the base of the Elder Tree's broken trunk, we see that the Elder Tree is actually growing again. And thus begins our final story analysis. This is a decent one, and the overall theme of the story feels like a throwback to the graveyard, with Knuckles' empathy and ability to sympathise with the plight of the ancient trees being the key to saving the day. The strip is notable for introducing Ebony, who would go on to befriend Fleetway's Supersonic and become a fan favourite character. She's got a great look, and anyone with magical powers is cool in my book. It goes without saying, but Dobbyn's artwork is fantastic as usual, and of particular note, the drastic change in the trees when the Elder Tree is blasted is a very effective moment. The trees look genuinely creepy. Environmentalist themes were almost omnipresent in Sonic media of the 1990s. Robotnik was portrayed in the West as an imperialistic, tyrannical mogul who actively despised nature and the natural world and sought to control, subdue, and destroy it. The theme can't really be understated. It's a key part of Robotnik's motivation in Sonic the comic. I always liked this seemingly now forgotten environmentalist slant on the series because it frames the creation of artificial zones like Casino Night Zone and Carnival Night Zone as a little bit sinister and trespassing on the natural world. Overall, a fun little story, but it sadly brings Knuckles' journey through Mobius to an end. Ultimately, Roots is one of the last solo strips to feature Knuckles in the comic. The next few strips were essentially kind of tie-ins to the larger story revolving around Sonic and Supersonic that was happening at the time in the lead up to issue 100. And after that story concluded, Knuckles did appear every so often in the comic's main Sonic strips and guest starred in some Tails strips, but because he was never a permanent member of the Freedom Fighters, Knuckles was largely missing in action in the last few years of the comic. A real shame, considering how strong Fleetway's Knuckles material was. But I appreciate what the creative partnership of Kitching and Dobbyn brought to the table. Like I said, please do share your thoughts on Fleetway Knuckles. I just like the slightly different, nuanced direction that Kitching took Knuckles' character. He's multifaceted and perhaps a little bit of a deeper personality than the rest of the crew. Thanks for joining me. If you enjoyed this video, check out my Fleetway Sonic playlist for more. See you next time.